So now let's take a closer look at some actual practical uses. We're going to start with a switch container. Now, a really common use for the switch container is in terms of surfaces for footsteps. In a game, you're going to have your character walking around on a lot of different types of surfaces, maybe wet or concrete, gravel, a lot of different situations. And switch containers can allow you to switch between different sets of footsteps to seamlessly transition according to what kind of surface the player is standing on. The game would send calls to Wise, telling Wise to switch the footsteps switch container according to the current surface. So let's take a look at how we can do that now. Let's go back to our Game Syncs tab to our new switch group, and we'll change the name of this to Surfaces. Now you can put as many switches here as you want, as many surfaces as you want, but in our case, we're just going to use gravel and grass. So now let's go back over to our audio tab, and we are going to duplicate our footsteps. We'll name one of these gravel and one grass. Right now, these are still all populated with gravel, but we don't have to worry about that right now. We can populate our new audio assets after we've completed the structure. So now we have our two separate events, but the joy of a switch container is that we don't need to continuously stop and trigger these events according to the player's surface. We can control them both with a switch container parent. So select them both, and let's create a new parent switch container. And we're going to call this Surface Footsteps. Now, this isn't going to work on its own. It needs to be assigned a switch group, and we've already created that switch group. So let's go ahead and select Surfaces, and then we're going to go ahead and tell it what our default switch is going to be. So this is if Wise hasn't received any kind of specific instructions, it will just assume that this is the correct surface, and for that we'll pick gravel. And now you may notice if you look down here in the contents editor that we have our two switch options, gravel and grass, in our assigned options over here on the right. And on the left, we have the children of that switch container available to us. So you can just click and drag Footsteps Gravel into gravel and Footsteps Grass into grass. Now would be a good time to replace our grass footsteps with actual grass recordings. This is what the grass footsteps sound like. So let's try out our switch container. You may remember that down here in the transport control, we have some options. We looked at that earlier with our RTPCs. So there's also a switches button, and here we can select what switch is active. So let's try it out now. And you're going to notice that even though we've changed our switch to grass, we're still playing the gravel footsteps. Now, the reason for that is that we have set ourselves into this continuous loop, and Wise is not looking at that switch container right now, so it doesn't see that a new option has been selected. In its current state, the switch container would have to be stopped and re-triggered in order for that new surface to be recognized. Now, if our footsteps were single shots, where every single footstep was triggering the event again and again, this wouldn't be a problem. But since we're using loops, we're going to have to do one extra step to make sure this works correctly. So go back into the switch container, and you notice up here on the top right, we have a play mode option. So the default is step, and this means that a change in status for the switch container is only recognized again when it is re-triggered. So if we switch this over to continuous, now it will be looking for switch container changes while we're inside any kind of child container loops. So that will help us seamlessly switch between different surfaces even while a footstep loop is playing. Let's give it a shot. So now you can see that we already have basic switch container functionality that will allow us to switch smoothly between various kinds of surfaces according to the game's input. Let's take a look at one more little feature that will allow us to customize this even more, and that is the fade in and fade out option here. So let's say that we don't want that sudden change. If we're mid-step, we don't want to have a sudden cut moving from gravel to grass. So we can do a crossfade essentially. Let's try 0.2 of a second. And listen again. So you can see the transition feels just a little bit more smooth, a little bit more natural. And there's a lot of options here for you to just customize the sound you're looking for your specific situation. Now we've looked at how to program a switch container, so the next step is how to actually have that programming realized in the game. So we've looked at events before, and yes, sure enough, we can switch our switch container status with an event. So you could go ahead and set switch, and then you would have to set your switch group. You would select it here, surfaces, and then select what you want this particular event to set the switch to. In our case, this particular event is going to set the surfaces switch to gravel. So when this event is triggered, our switch will change. But this is not the only way to change a switch. Switches are actually available directly in code, and so your programmer can send a switch message directly to Wise. This could be quite useful. It can save a little bit of time and make for more efficient coding, but that really depends on your context. And I would warn you against setting the same switches with code and events depending on where in the game you are, because this can confuse Wise, and more importantly, it can confuse you. It could lead to unexpected functionality and become quite difficult to debug. So I would recommend that you consult with your programmer or your sound artist and just ensure that you're all on the same page. Now, there's just one last thing that I want to remind you of. Let's say that we already had a footsteps event from a previous lesson, and that event was populated with footsteps gravel. That would be fine and dandy, and then one day we go ahead and we decide to create a more elaborate structure on top of that. If we don't replace that footsteps gravel in the footsteps event with its parent level switch container, then that functionality is not going to come through as expected. This may seem very straightforward and basic, but this is a really common mistake where throughout the game you're creating more and more elaborate structures, and you're not always remembering to populate your events with the updated parent container. With all of that in mind, I would like you to take a look at the run footsteps that are available with both grass and gravel surfaces in the course material, and build your own switch container that will allow either grass or gravel to switch using a single run switch event.